Hi, my name's Ali, and this is the Russophiles Unite podcast, where ordinarily we watch Russian films and films with a Russian connection. I say ordinarily because this time around we've got another bonus episode in which I am speaking to author Alex Christofi, who has just released a new biography of the great 19th century Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky called Dostoevsky in Love. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with Alex. Hi, Alex. Thanks very much for joining me. So we're going to discuss your book, Dostoevsky in Love. At one point, Dostoevsky, I think it was in a letter, lamented that if he had Tolstoy's resources, then he'd be able to have written something that would still be read in 100 years. Well, as it turns out, he needn't have worried on that score. This year is the 200th anniversary of his birth. It's about 140 years since he died. So why would you say that his work has endured this long, and what made you want to write a book about him?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question because in some ways, he endured despite actually having a pretty unpopular message during much of the 20th century. You know, one of the big things that he was trying to sort of say to Russian society towards the end of his life was, you know, if we're not careful, we'll end up with, you know, a violent kind of socialism. And obviously that message went down like a lead balloon come the revolution.
Yeah, not exactly the literary figure that the Soviet Union was wanting to champion.
No.
It's kind of interesting doing a show about films normally is that there's a big long gap at the beginning of the Soviet Union, as far as I can tell, before his work starts to be adapted. At a certain point, it's kind of like, well, he's world famous, so we want the prestige. But, you know, in the few decades immediately following the revolution, it's like, nah, we're not touching that with a barge pole.
But the irony is that actually he in some ways was one of the most devoted people to raising up the downtrodden, to giving people a voice if they were poor or perhaps disabled or people who were scorned by society, like prostitutes. So in some ways, he was a very compassionate person, and he was doing all these interesting things with literature that that you wouldn't necessarily associate with the kind of gentry type novel of Anna Karenina. So I think he's a really fascinating person, and I think the fact that, you know, you can read a novel like Crime and Punishment today and it feels modern and it feels like it's leaping off the page at you is just testament to his talent.
Yeah, quite often, I mean, we'll get on to adaptations maybe later, but often adaptations will just transpose his stories to the present day because, yeah, some of the trappings are different, but the essential stories can work without it seeming too far removed. Because, as you say, Anna Karenina, it's very aristocratic, which most people can't relate to. But yeah, someone being a poor student, okay, maybe you can't relate to the axe murder side of things. But yeah, the sort of trying to make ends meet and, you know, difficult circumstances, that's very, very relatable. So, and in terms of your experience with him, when did you first start reading his works, and what prompted that?
Well, I remember picking up Crime and Punishment when I was sort of 17 years old in a bookshop and just being kind of, I suppose, shocked at the audacity, because you think of, you know, at the time I thought of literature as being this thing that was very approved, and it was something that sort of discussed you know, social norms, I suppose, rather than challenging them too much. You know, I hadn't read a huge amount outside of like the classroom. And I suppose, yeah, the fact that someone could kind of create a protagonist who was supposed to be even vaguely sympathetic, whose avowed mission was to sort of knock someone over the head with an axe and steal all their money. I mean, it just seemed kind of outrageous. I couldn't believe it was allowed to be published now, let alone 150 years ago in Russia.
Yeah.
And I kept reading him, and I suppose he was one of those writers I kept coming back to because I always got something different from him. And then later on, it was only a few years ago, I began to have this feeling that not as many people as I had assumed kind of knew very much about his life, and he had such an interesting, even if he hadn't been a writer, he had such an interesting life. So I guess just on the simplest level, I really wanted to sort of tell his story and to find an accessible way to talk about him for those who found his work maybe looked intimidating.
Yes, there is a certain amount of the fact that just his most famous books are, breeze blocks and they're, high page count, and you just can't. I'm not sure. This is a big time commitment. I mean, obviously with lockdowns, you've got a bit more time maybe to read than people might normally have.
Yeah.
But yeah, he definitely has the incredibly famous, but also incredibly intimidating reputation. I was fortunate enough to read editions that were like heavily annotated, so I'd kind of come across like the elements of his story. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, often I guess the stereotype of a writer is, well, they spend their days hunched over their desk. Yeah. And that's about it. But yeah, in terms of incident, you could definitely make not just a movie about his life, a mini-series probably, yeah. and you certainly wouldn't be short of material. So I wanted to talk about the approach that you took for the book, because it's not, in some ways, it's not really a conventional biography. I mean, it's chronological, but you've done this thing where you've like woven excerpts from both his fiction and his letters and his journal columns, because he was, people won't necessarily know that he was a novelist, but he was, to make ends meet, he ran various journals with varying degrees of success. So there's all this writing, and you've interspersed that through the story. How did that idea come to you, and was it hard to kind of persuade your publisher that was how the book should be?
Yeah, well, I mean, what was interesting to me was I knew that there's this entry in one of his notebooks from later on in his life where he sort of says quite explicitly, I would actually quite like to write my memoirs, but I'm already 56. I don't know if I'll have the time, essentially. And sadly, he was absolutely right about that. He never got round to his memoirs.
Yeah, his health was a state. So yeah, you think from a modern perspective, mid-50s, oh yeah, you've probably got plenty of years left. But yeah, 19th century plus, chronic conditions and some habits, which we could get onto.
Yeah, I mean, not least his epilepsy, which was, he was told in his 30s that basically any day of his life could be his last day because it was so severe. He might just, and there was no real way of managing it, particularly back then. So he never got around to writing his memoirs, but he did have this kind of very clever way of weaving elements of his own memories and his own sort of sense impressions and things that he'd had come across in his own life in with his fiction as a way of kind of making it more vivid. And I felt like some of the most powerful parts of his fiction were drawn from life in some ways. So I wanted to see if it was possible to kind of get some of the book into the first person to make it feel intimate and give it the feeling of a kind of reconstructed memoir almost, albeit with bits of my narration in the third person to join it all up.
Yeah, the kind of the scaffolding to make it make sense.
Yeah, exactly. And I had quite a clear idea that it would be a non-fiction book. I talked to a couple of different publishers, and one of them I think said, my background is as a novelist, and they said to me, why don't you just write it as a novel? You don't have to do all the endnotes, and you can kind of, people will accept that you're creating a kind of fictionalized version, and that's obviously a bit more within my comfort zone. But I guess the difficulty for me there was like some of the best lines in the book are Dostoevsky's, and it somehow would have seemed disingenuous to me to sort of claim that it was all me. I wanted to sort of show my working, and I think there's also something kind of exciting about there's this sort of tightrope walk of am I going to be able to pull it off? It's an interesting idea, but is there a way of being original with it and without, on the one hand, you being original, on the other hand, not sort of just simply lifting whole pieces and kind of lacking originality. So it ended up being a non-fiction book, but certainly at the creative end.
Yeah. I mean, for my money, like when I read the concept, I kind of thought, well, that's a very interesting idea on paper, but that sounds like it would be hard to pull off. But you manage it with aplomb, and it's just
Oh, thank you.
brilliant idea, brilliantly executed, and it was a real privilege to read. Inspired idea, and just really great to, especially for those who are, like I mentioned, potentially intimidated by Dostoevsky's
Yeah.
writing. This is a good way of getting a lot of it, and then maybe that being a springboard to actually going and reading his work. Because you'd hope that a biography would do that anyway, but because so much of it is his text. My dilemma with this was just kind of like, oh right, now I have to like reread all of the novels I've already read and read all the stuff that I haven't. I don't have time.
Yeah, I feel like that's a compliment though. If someone reads my book and then wants to read
Mm.
Dostoevsky, then I'm basically just his hype man, essentially.
Because otherwise, otherwise it's totally obscure. No, but it's there is a thing about particularly 19th century authors, that it's just kind of like there's a combination of them being intimidating and a bit kind of like unhip and like, well, dead white guys
Yeah.
kind of thing. And it's like, well, no, they are famous for a reason. It's just obviously read plenty of other stuff as well, but there is a reason their reputation is what it is. But certainly, you know, you can understand Dostoevsky, living his life not thinking that in 100 years people are still going to have heard of me.
Yeah.
Whereas maybe Tolstoy probably thought that you would be.
I think Tolstoy was
But
quite full of
anyway,
himself, but with good reason, he was very talented.
yeah. Tolstoy is one of those, incredibly infuriating people who thinks they're a genius and happens to be right about that. It's bad enough when someone thinks that they're a genius and they're not, but when they're actually right, it's
Insufferable.
yeah. But anyway, we digress. So you decided on the title Dostoevsky in Love, which I feel like is a kind of a fun kind of twist on maybe Shakespeare in Love, because you think Shakespeare, yeah, romantic, that works. Dostoevsky, really?
Yeah.
Scary beardy guy. But there's a good reason for it, obviously. So there were three women in particular: Maria Isaeva, Polina Suslova, and Anna Snitkina, who had a huge impact on him. Could you tell us a bit more about those three women?
Yeah, so it's structured around, I mean, it has to be said, he doesn't come to be properly in love and happily so until kind of quite late on in his life, but he's it's not for lack of trying.
Oh my goodness, no.
As you say, there were these three. I mean, he must have made proposals to about six women, but there were three women who he really loved in different ways and at different times in his life. And what I thought was really interesting, part of the reason that I structured the book around them in a way, was in some ways they represent his sort of maturing over the years. His first love, Maria, who he meets out in Siberia, having been kind of basically exiled there. She was a kind of romantic figure with a big R. She was, very sickly and slim and pale and had a fiery temper. And she was basically like the characters that he was reading in his novels as a child. She was like the perfect sort of romantic heroine, even to the extent of having a drunkard husband who didn't love her, and she was left in poverty when he died, and she ended up sadly having consumption and died too young. His second love, who he actually met while he was already estranged from Maria, effectively. She was a young student, and kind of represented in some ways that this young student generation of political radicals who he felt he needed to connect with and talk to and try to sort of bring them round, I suppose, so that he could kind of avoid Russia collapsing. I mean, he was getting very, very involved in politics at this time, and Polina was a very political person. She's one of the very few people who could dominate him as well. And you have to have a very forceful personality to be able to dominate a person like Dostoevsky. And then his third love was who became his second wife, Anna, was very much a committed Christian, a family person. They had a very happy family together. They had 4 children. Sadly, 2 of them died very young, which wasn't uncommon at that time. But it was her who really provided the family life that he wanted for a long time. And actually, she did a huge amount to secure his legacy. She collected so many of his papers and made sure editions of his works, proper editions, were being published and that kind of thing. So she's he has a huge amount to thank her for.
Oh my goodness, yeah, he kind of really lucked out
Yeah, he did.
by meeting her, because she was incredibly long suffering, and he did, I think, judging from your book, her stabilizing influence did eventually kind of calm him down and, help him get to a more stable place. But initially their relationship was, well, it's amazing that she put up with him, to be honest. Yes, that was my next going to be my next question is that he was in many ways, I mean, we've talked about his health problems, but he was a very self-destructive person in some ways, in terms of his habits, and he seems like he was often extremely bad-tempered and not easy to be around. What was that like, spending that much, figuratively spending that much time around him? Was that quite hard work in some ways?
Yeah, it's a funny one, because after a certain point of work, I think this must be true of most biographers. Past a certain point, you really start to, when you've read the first 1,000 letters, you start to kind of see where he's going wrong, and you almost want to kind of tell him off as if he's a sibling or something. You start to get a relationship that becomes close, and I suppose could become unhealthy. I think it's really important or what was important for me was to be really clear about where I felt he was just way off base, or had kind of gone off piste, I suppose, either in his behavior or, there certain beliefs that he subscribed to that I don't necessarily. And actually, one of the things that I did while writing the book was to try to create kind of layers in it. So there's obviously his words in his own words in the first person. There's the third person narration, which pretty much is still in his head. It's kind of free and direct, and if for instance he doesn't like a person, then the third person narration would be pretty mean about them too.
Yep, there's plenty of that.
Yep, there's some of that. He was quite judgmental, but I did think it was important to create another layer that was really me, the author. So there were quite a few footnotes in the book where I quite consciously separate my own take from his, or kind of stand back, I suppose, at one removal, or there's a kind of ironic distance, because sometimes his behavior isn't really defensible, or certain.
Oh yeah, and
well, yeah, having read the book, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about.
Yes. Oh my goodness. I mean, particularly the gambling side of things, in I've got a system. It's like, yeah, sure you do, Fyodor. Has the system worked before? And it's just like, oh my goodness. I mean, it's an addiction, so it's a terrible thing. But there's just, there's just like an exasperation you feel with him, just like, because eventually he does learn, but it just takes so long, and he causes so much suffering in the process that you're just like,
the temptation,
you just kind of want to have a stern word with him.
And because the temptation for me was, it's so painful to witness that your gut reaction is, okay, it's painful, I need to cut it down, I need to just summarize it and just say it was a terrible time and he kept making the same mistakes. But actually, to do justice to it, you sort of have to show how much how low he falls, how much he imposes on the people who care about him, and kind of, I think the only way to really do justice to that period of his life is to kind of show how bad it got, rather than skimming over it, I suppose.
Yeah, no, it was frequently a hard read for that reason, but I think it was absolutely the right choice. And you mentioned irony. I liked the fact that this wasn't a. You clearly admire, aspects of the guy's character and certainly his work, but you're not like reverential and like. Yeah, it doesn't have that, which is quite refreshing.
Yeah, I mean, he's infuriating.
Because after all, he's a human being.
Yeah, he's absolutely infuriating, man. But he's also, I mean, he's really funny and he's really generous with his time and with his possessions, and that kind of, to me, that makes him more interesting. I mean, I don't think you could. He couldn't be written off as an angel or a devil.
No, it was far more complicated than that. And I'm glad you mentioned the humor, because that's something that definitely came out in the book, and it's not something I've always appreciated with reading his work on the page. But I caught a BBC radio adaptation of Devils, which I'd never actually read, but there was a lot of kind of ironic humor and just the way he paints a character and just the kind of I don't know, it's kind of almost like Jane Austen-like, but in much less genteel surroundings. Just these ridiculously self-deluded people who are, convinced of their own brilliance. So yeah, he is very funny. But with a lot of the self-destructive behavior, it's kind of baffling, just because he's somebody with so much psychological insight. You kind of think, if he'd turned that insight round on himself a bit more, he might have had, a slightly easier time of things. But then again, he was suffering all sorts of health problems, and we haven't even touched on like the very dramatic, like not adolescence, but his post-adolescence, his 20s and his 30s. That experience clearly would have a big effect on anyone.
Yeah, I think the mock execution that he went through when he was 29 was, in some ways it was the most traumatic, consequential day of his life, because none of us normally have to confront our own mortality at the age of 29. It's just not something we normally have to do. So I think it did kind of add that a sense of urgency that maybe wasn't there in some of his contemporaries.
Yeah, and just some of the suffering like he endured in exile / prison, and also that he witnessed of the other prisoners. It's just how, if it's going to be a rare individual who that doesn't have some kind of outspill into how they live their lives. And so one thing I did want to ask is he was obviously around at the same time as many other famous Russian writers. What was his relationship like with them?
Yeah, he had a circle of people around him that he really admired and trusted, and they wouldn't necessarily be recognizable names to us unless you kind of study Russian literature in the 19th century. They're not household names. So people like Apollon Maikov, Nikolai Strakhov, who at the time were influential, and they had their own readerships. One of the things, as you mentioned earlier, was that he founded his own journal because he really wanted to sort of create his own group of writers and to push their own message. But he did he came into contact with many of the more famous writers. One of the things that just constantly tickled me was his kind of on-off French, what is basically a frenemy with Turgenev.
Yes.
So Turgenev, they met when they were in their 20s, and Turgenev was really nice to him at first, but then sort of found him a bit dull company and slightly overbearing. So they wrote a kind of mocking poem about him with their friend Nekrasov. And Dostoevsky was very humiliated by this. But later on, he saw the novel Fathers and Sons, and Dostoevsky just thought it was amazing. And it was one of the very few journals that actually published a nice review about it at the time. Most people were pretty scathing.
Yeah, Turgenev managed to alienate like both ends of the political spectrum with that. Yeah. Like, people who would normally disagree about everything, like, united with, like, no, this what Turgenev has written is completely out of order and not right.
Yeah. By trying to be a reasonable person, he essentially alienated both left and right wings in different ways. I think so, one person.
Well, that doesn't sound like something that would happen today.
Yeah, I know exactly. Yeah, so irrelevant. But yeah,
Mm.
I mean, he was a great writer, but he also was a passionate sort of Europhile and particularly loved Germany and opera. And eventually, when Dostoevsky became, the older he got, the more he became convinced of that Russia was kind of at the center of world culture, and that it was going to kind of unify the world in its way, because it could kind of bring in all these elements of East and West and so on. And so his whole like philosophy of life just completely clashed with Turgenev's, and they had a huge argument. It didn't help that Dostoevsky owed Turgenev money. He borrowed 50 thalers, German thalers, from him in sort of 1963 or something like that. 1863. And by the time he gave them back to Turgenev, he paid the debt. I think the thaler was defunct. It was like a long time afterwards.
Oh, right. Because that is around the time of the whole like German like gradual unification process.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
Yeah, all these
the currency got updated
smaller states going
before
away.
the debt
Yeah.
did. So
yeah.
that's pretty pretty special.
Oh goodness, yeah. Yes, I have to say, I imagine a nightmare job would be being Dostoevsky's accountant, because just all of the people asking him for money,
Yeah.
and all the people who've lent him, all this different money in different currencies. I imagine that probably ended up being Anna's job a lot of the time.
Yeah. Poor Anna. I mean, he was so bad with money. People, when people say, "Oh, I'm bad with money," what they mean is like, "Oh, I meant to spend £5 on lunch, but I spent 7." Like, Dostoevsky accidentally lost his mother-in-law's house, for instance. I mean, he was really bad with money.
Pretty bad. Yeah. Oh my goodness! Just like patience of a saint. Anyone spending, extended time with him, especially Anna. But yeah, so we talked a little bit about politics already. Now, what I'd gathered prior to reading your book, he started off essentially as a sort of left wing. Maybe not revolutionary himself, but he hung out in those circles. And then later on in his life, when he becomes, really, really famous, he's more of a right-wing reactionary. But it's not quite as simple as that, is it?
Is it? I mean, I think that probably is the prevailing view. What I was trying to do was to kind of marry up what he said about himself with the view that we've inherited from other academics and scholars. And I mean, I think he felt quite strongly that he was trying to find a middle path between the left and the right. And some of the things that he cared about most weren't necessarily kind of mutually exclusive. So, the thing that he was eventually locked up for in his youth was trying to emancipate the serfs, which was, I mean, it was a kind of a left-wing cause, but it was broadly a liberal cause. It wasn't an outrageous thing to be agitating for at the time. He was arrested as part of a kind of general clampdown on civil society, because there'd been all these revolutions in like 1848 in Italy, and the Tsar was basically scared that the intelligentsia might kind of lead an uprising against him, and so he kind of preemptively rounded up some likely suspects. So this idea of him as a kind of hardcore left-wing person, there is truth to it, but I don't think he ever really identified himself as a kind of left-wing radical in that way. And then on the flip side, at the other end of his life, you have him. I mean, definitely he was socializing with some very, very conservative people. He edited a conservative journal, and he just also had some views that we would think of now as pretty unsavory when he was writing his writer's diary, which was like his sort of self-published journal. It was very, very popular at the time, but it was pretty jingoistic and nationalistic. He didn't have very modern views on Jews and the place of Jewish people within the Russian state. All of this, I think, I don't think we should minimize that. I think by our standards, he was anti-Semitic, and that's not the part of his his worldview that I can really identify with. I don't think anyone would defend that part of his worldview. But it's also within the context of a Russia that was kind of institutionally anti-Semitic. This guy wasn't kind of out on his own. And at the same time, you had national movements springing up in France. Victor Hugo really thought that France was going to be the center of world culture, and Paris would be the very center, but it would be like federal Europe. And Dostoevsky basically thought the same thing about Russia. So he was really nationalistic. But in the context of the time, I think we shouldn't judge him too much or kind of write him off as being having deeply unsavory views for the time. I think there were certainly a couple of views that we wouldn't subscribe to today. But I actually think there is a continuity between those two ends of his life. I don't think there's a huge... People sometimes paint it as if there's this huge contradiction and he completely has this volte-face. And actually, I think his views do progress over time, but probably you could see continuities there across his whole life.
And he also got published by journals on both sides of the spectrum as well. So it seemed like he had connections with people, in the intelligentsia, kind of like across the spectrum. So yeah, he wasn't, exclusively keeping himself to one section or the other. And certainly from reading his writings, he can seem quite sympathetic to characters who are very, very far from what his own beliefs would have been, and you wouldn't necessarily know that those were his beliefs if you didn't know them just from reading his characters, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think he really... one of the things he believed in very passionately was sort of the idea of free speech and dialogue and talking through ideas. Obviously the problems with free speech that we have, that we're talking about in 2021 are partly to do with bad faith. But I think he believed that, if you take for granted that everyone has good faith, you can talk openly about ideas and what do we want politics to look like? What do we want society to look like? And eventually, if you talk enough and you think enough, you'll come to a good answer.
Yeah, there's very much a kind of like having to engage with the other side's ideas to kind of sharpen one's own and actually like take them seriously and not always dismiss them out of hand. But yeah, as you say, there can be quite a lot of bad faith argument out there, and that doesn't help anything.
Yeah.
But anyway, okay. Well, this has been great. Thank you very much for being so generous with your time. But there was one question I did want to ask before we finished. This being normally a film podcast, I had to ask: are there any adaptations of Dostoevsky's work that you've seen and enjoyed?
Yeah, there's the famous Crime and Punishment from 1935, which was directed by Joseph von Starberg. It's absolutely terrible, but it's got Peter Lorre in it, and I
worth the price of admission.
I love Peter Lorre. He's just amazing, and once you've seen him play Raskolnikov, he kind of ruins it for you forever, in the way that you can imagine he would. I would watch anything with Peter Lorre in it. The really good, there's a Russian language series of Dostoevsky's life which is really good from about 2010, I think, which is up on Amazon Prime, so I'd really recommend that. But my favorite, the one that I think is it's quite a loose adaptation but definitely worth watching, it's actually a film short by Martin Scorsese called Life Lessons. It was part of an anthology called New York Stories, which I think was organized by Woody Allen. Certainly Woody Allen's got one of the three short films, but one of them's by Scorsese, and it sort of loosely follows the plot and the time in Dostoevsky's life when he was writing a novel called The Gambler. So you've got an artist who's trying to paint, but he's also sort of tormented by this, what for Dostoevsky was Polina. It becomes Pauline in the film. It's not pretending to be set in the roulette tables of Baden-Baden in 1863, but it's it's in modern day Manhattan. But it's very true to the spirit, and I think it's a lovely short actually, and not I don't think particularly well known.
Oh, not at all. I'd never heard of it, so I'm very keen to check that out. I'm a big fan of Kurosawa's adaptation of The
Oh
Idiot
yeah.
from the 1950s. It's long enough between me watching the film and reading the novel to be able to actually comment on how faithful it is as an adaptation, but it's really good and just kind of gothic and cool. From the sublime to the ridiculous. I've not seen this, but just the fact that it's out there makes me very, very curious. There's a very late 50s adaptation of the Brothers Karamazov with William Shatner of all
Oh
people
God.
as as Alexei Karamazov, which is just kind of like, okay, that's got to be an interesting watch. So maybe I'll get around to
Wow,
it
that sounds
one day.
awful.
But yeah,
I might watch the Kurosawa instead.
I think that might be the way to go. But yes, on that note, thanks again very much for your time. This has been really, really fun, and yeah, can't recommend your book
Oh,
enough.
thank you very
Thank you.
much. Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
I hope you've enjoyed this special episode of the Roos Files Unite podcast. If you're listening from the UK, you can pick up a copy of Dostoevsky in Love and financially support the show at the same time. And you can do that by clicking the uk.bookshop.org affiliate link in the show notes. As those aren't always the easiest to find, depending on what your podcatcher is, I'll also be including that link on the show's various social media channels, so check those out too. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at the moment. If you're listening from outside of the UK, then you should be able to pick up Dostoevsky in Love from wherever you normally get your books. Thanks again for listening, and goodbye.